The fog over the bay that day was not just a weather phenomenon. It was the physical embodiment of oblivion. Thick, milky white, it absorbed sounds and distorted space, turning the familiar outlines of the shore into blurred spots of uncertainty. It was from this whiteness that, on the cold morning of October 14, 1962, the passenger ferry Northwind slowly and majestically set sail. She wasn't an old ship, but she wasn't a new one either. She was a hard worker, accustomed to the vagaries of this northern sea. Its sides, painted dark blue, seemed to absorb the dim light of the autumn sun without reflecting it. There was a lively bustle on the decks of the last minutes before sailing. Passengers wrapped in coats and raincoats said goodbye to the mourners. The sailors cast off the mooring lines, and thick black smoke slowly poured out of the chimney, mixing with the fog and creating a ghostly plume. Captain Artyom Volkov, a man with a weathered face and calm eyes, stood on the bridge, consulting a map. For him, this flight was a chore, 100 miles of the same. The route was simple and well-studied. From the coastal port to the island village of Rocky with one intermediate stop. 3 hours, no more. There was no sign of trouble that day. The radio operator contacted the port several times, reporting on the exit and visibility conditions. His last message was concise and businesslike. "We are entering a zone of dense fog. The connection may be interrupted. The next session is at 11:30. The clock on the bridge was inexorably approaching the 2:47 mark. There was a separate life inside the ferry. The first-class cabin smelled of coffee, expensive tobacco, and the smell of seawater soaked into the upholstery of the seats. It housed local officials returning from a meeting and a couple of tourists with expensive cameras. They did not pay attention to the fogged portholes, immersed in their own thoughts or quiet conversations. Below, in the general cabin, it was noisier and more crowded. Fishermen with tight bundles, women with baskets full of provisions, children loitering between the rows of seats. One boy, about 5 years old, dropped a wooden rocking horse on the floor, and it rolled under the chair with a thud. His mother, a tired woman in a headscarf, picked up the toy, dusted it off and shoved it back into the child's hands. In the bar, the steward was arranging glasses and glasses, preparing for the influx of passengers who wanted to warm up after the coolness of the deck. In the engine room, all metal surfaces vibrated to the beat of the diesel engines. The oily, hot air was filled with the roar of machinery, the ship's heartbeat. 2 mechanics, accustomed to this noise, were making routine rounds, checking the readings of numerous pressure gauges. Everything was within the normal range. The Northwind was a functioning, well-functioning system, a small world floating through a white void. The disappearance was swift and absolute. According to all the rules, the next communication session was supposed to take place at 2:47. The radio operator of the coastal port, a young guy named Victor, set up the receiver and prepared to write a report in the log. But the broadcast was silent. There were no familiar noises, no hissing, no voice of the partner from the Northwind. Just an oppressive, lifeless silence. Victor tried to get in touch himself. Calmly at first, then more insistently, with growing alarm in his voice. "Northwind, over. Northwind, please respond." His calls went into the void without meeting any response. At that moment, he still did not understand the scale of what was happening, blaming everything on interference due to fog or a temporary malfunction of the equipment. But the minutes turned into hours, and the ether remained dead. Not a single distress signal, not a single fragmentary phrase, not even an SOS code. The ship seemed to have disappeared into the fog, dropped out of reality, without leaving behind the slightest clue. The alarm was only announced in the late afternoon, when it became clear that the ferry had not just been delayed, but had disappeared. The following weeks became a time of hope, slowly turning into despair. The search operation was the largest in the entire history of the region. The Coast Guard, warships, volunteers on fishing boats, and even aviation participated in it. They combed every square mile of the proposed route, explored remote islands, checked out every single, even the craziest version. But the sea and sky remained silent. No wreckage, no lifeboats, no oil stains on the water. Nothing. The Northwind and 90, 7 people on board, 42 crew members and 55 passengers disappeared without a trace. The investigation conducted by the Maritime Commission did not yield any results. One version is crazier than the other, from a sudden storm, which for some reason was not recorded by other ships, to an attack by a foreign submarine. No evidence has been found. The official conclusion read, "Missing for reasons that cannot be determined." Over time, newspapers stopped publishing articles about the mysterious ferry. The coastal port received a new, more modern vessel, and the families of the missing gradually learned to live with a hole in the place of the heart. The story of the North Wind gradually turned into a legend, into a gloomy tale that was told to newcomers in the port taverns, scaring them with the treachery of the local waters. 10 years have passed. Exactly 10 years of silence and oblivion. The autumn of 1972 was extremely windy and cold. The fishing boat Udacha, owned by 2 brothers, the experienced Gennady and his younger partner Lev, was struggling with high waves in the very center of the bay. They were looking for a shoal of herring, but luck, contrary to the name of their boat, turned away from them that day. The fog, as thick as it had been 10 years ago, hung over the water again, limiting visibility to several tens of meters. It was Leva who first noticed the dark silhouette slowly bobbing on the waves. At first, he thought it was a large whale or maybe a drifting ice floe. But as the luck approached, the outlines began to take on familiar, sinister shapes. The silhouette turned into the hull of a ship, dark blue, peeling but intact. Gennady, standing at the helm, felt his blood turn cold. He was older and remembered those days. He remembered the posters of the missing ferry. And now he was looking at a ghost that had materialized out of the fog and the past. It was the North Wind. He looked as if he had walked out of the dock yesterday, and not disappeared without a trace a decade ago. There were no signs of long-term exposure to salt water, rust, or fouling on its sides. The ship was completely intact, as if time had passed it by. It was just drifting, silent and lifeless, in the very heart of the bay, from where it had once been so carefully searched. For a long time, the brothers did not dare to come closer, feeling the chilling horror emanating from this inexplicable sight. They reported the discovery on the radio, and their voices conveyed not so much the joy of discovery as an animal, primal fear. The ghost is back. The news of the discovery spread along the coast with the speed of a forest fire. For several hours, the bay, which is usually deserted and harsh, was flooded with Coast Guard boats, research vessels and reporters' boats. They all crowded at a respectful distance from the drifting ferry, like a flock of small fish surrounding a sleeping leviathan. The North Wind towered over them with its silence, and that peace was far more terrifying than any storm. The Coast Guard cutter Sentinel was the first to approach him. The young sailor, who was standing in the bow with a boat hook to cling to the railing, could not hide the trembling in his hands. When the side of their vessel touched the worn hull of the ferry with a thud, an icy chill ran down everyone's spine. It seemed that the atmosphere around the North Wind was different, thicker, heavier, sucking out sound and light. The crew of the Sentinel boarded, breaking the 10-year silence that reigned on deck. Their footsteps echoed loudly in the white fog, which seemed unwilling to let go of its acquisition. They moved slowly, with guns drawn, even though reason told them that there was no enemy here, and there never had been. But my instincts screamed the opposite. The first thing that struck them was the unnatural safety of the vessel. The deck was clean, almost sterile. There was no layer of sea salt on it, no bird droppings, no rotting algae. The metal parts shone with a dull sheen under a layer of light moisture, as if they had just been wiped with a cloth. An ideal, extinct order reigned everywhere, broken only by rare evidence of a suddenly interrupted life. A child's doll in a bright dress lay at the entrance to the control room, her glass eyes staring at the whitish sky. One of the rescuers noticed an open book on the bench, the pages of which were wet, but not swollen from the water, as if they had been closed just a few hours ago. But the most terrifying thing was the sound. At first, it was mistaken for noise in his own ears, but no. A quiet, intermittent melody is coming from the loudspeakers hung on the deck. An old, long-forgotten radio show, the host of which enthusiastically talked about the successes in space exploration. This program aired in the fall of 1962, and it was shut down in 1963. The voice from the loudspeaker was the only thing that broke the oppressive silence, and that made it even scarier. It seemed that the ship itself was stuck in a time loop, at the very moment when it ceased to exist for the outside world. The next group to board was a group of researchers, an investigator from the Maritime Commission, Kovalev, a man with an impenetrable face and a cold mind, and a couple of shipbuilding engineers. They began a methodical inspection, moving from bow to stern, trying not to succumb to the superstitious fear that was shrouding their consciousness in a sticky fog. In the first-class lounge, they found tables set for an unfinished breakfast. The coffee grounds were still in the cups, and there were cookie crumbs on the saucers. The chairs were neatly pushed back, as if the people had only briefly gone out to get some air on the deck. In the general salon, the picture was similar, but with elements of chaos inherent in a large crowd of people. There was a knitted sweatshirt on one of the seats, and a newspaper from that very day, October 14, 1962, on the other. The bar was gleaming with cleanliness, and there was a row of perfectly clean glasses behind the counter. No dust, no cobwebs, no signs of decomposition. The air inside was cold and still, with a subtle sweet smell that no one could identify. Not putrefaction, but something else, like the scent of long-withered, but not rotten flowers. The captain's cabin was locked. The door had to be opened with a crowbar. The interior was immaculate. There were ship's logs on the table, and a pen frozen in the air next to them. The clock on the wall, a mechanical one with a pendulum, stopped. The hands froze in a position that had already become fatal, 2:47. But the most disturbing discovery awaited them in the engine room. Going down was like diving into the belly of some ancient, sleeping beast. Echoing metal ladders, moist, oily air, replaced by icy cold. The giant diesel engines were silent, cold, and the silence was louder than any rumble. The walls were covered with a complex web of pipes and valves. And it was here, in the very heart of the ship, that their lanterns picked out something from the darkness that made one's blood run cold. There were prints everywhere on the metal walls, on the pipes, on the edges of the machinery. They were handprints, but their shape had nothing to do with humans. They were too elongated, with thin, almost bony fingers, and one or two joints longer than an adult man's palm. These prints ran along the walls as if someone or something was slowly and methodically walking around the compartment, holding onto the surfaces. The footprints were not made of dirt or blood, but like dents in the metal itself, as if it had become soft as wax for a moment and had frozen, retaining the touch of unknown fingers. The engineer who dared to touch one of these prints immediately withdrew his hand. The metal was icy, unnaturally cold, and this cold penetrated directly into the bones. At that moment, it became clear that the disappearance of people from the North Wind was not an accident. It was something else. Something that left behind only these creepy autographs on the walls of its steel crypt. The decision to tow the North Wind back to the coastal port was not easy. The authorities hesitated. Some considered the ship a floating grave that should be honorably sunk in deep water. Others, a priceless artifact, the key to the greatest mystery of the century. In the end, curiosity prevailed, tinged with a vague hope of providing answers to the families of the missing. The towing operation was like a funeral procession. The powerful tugboat Titan dragged the silent passenger slowly, with the strained roar of its engines. The North Wind dutifully followed him, its dark silhouette looking unnaturally small and defenseless against the background of gray waves. All the way to the port, it maintained its ominous silence, and only the old radio was still quietly broadcasting from 1962, its signal rising and falling, as if trying to communicate something. When the ferry was finally brought into the closed water area of the port and secured at the farthest, abandoned pier, a crowd gathered on the shore. The people looked at the ghost who had returned in silence. Among them were those who 10 years ago saw off their relatives here. There was no joy in their eyes, only bitter pain and bewilderment. The ship returned, but it brought with it not relief, but a new, deeper mystery. The next morning, an expanded group of experts boarded. Now it included not only marine engineers and investigators, but also criminologists, doctors, and even Igor Petrov, a young theoretical physicist seconded to the commission, whose task was to find any anomalies that defied conventional explanation. An inspection at the port under a bright electric light only emphasized the supernatural nature of the find. Laboratory analyses of air, water, and surface washout samples showed nothing. No bacteria, no viruses, no traces of chemical or radiation contamination. It was a purity bordering on the sterility of an otherworldly place. Criminologists carefully took fingerprints, but apart from the traces of the search team itself and possibly 10 years ago, blurred and indistinct fingerprints of people, nothing was found. Those elongated footprints in the engine room defied casting. The plaster did not stick to the icy metal, and attempts to make photogrammetry produced blurred, fuzzy images, as if the footprints themselves resisted documentation. Igor Petrov, a man of science, a skeptic to the core, carried out his measurements. He recorded strange fluctuations in the electromagnetic field at certain points of the ship, especially in the area of the engine room and the captain's cabin. The hands of his instruments twitched for no reason, showing either bursts or a complete fading of the background. But the most inexplicable thing was the chronometer. The clock on the captain's bridge, the one that showed 2:47, was carefully examined. They were in good working order, the factory was not fully deployed, the mechanism was not damaged. But when they tried to start them up again, the hands, after walking for a few minutes, stopped again at the same position, 2:47. It wasn't a breakdown. It was like a fundamental property of the space itself inside the north wind, looped at this fateful moment. Petrov stood on the bridge, looking at the frozen arrows, and for the first time in his career felt a chilling horror, not from ignorance, but from the realization that he was faced with something that broke all the laws he knew. Suddenly, he felt a faint movement of air. Not a draft, but rather a slight rarefaction, as if the ship had breathed for a moment. And at the same moment, it seemed to him that someone's thin, pale stripe had drawn through the misted glass of the porthole. But when he got closer, there was nothing there, just a thick fog behind the glass and the reflection of his own pale face. On the 5th day of the research, the first incident occurred. One of the criminologists working in the engine room suddenly lost consciousness. When they carried him out on deck, he came to himself, but he was not himself. His eyes were frozen, wide open. His lips were silently whispering the same word, shadows. He couldn't explain what had happened. All he remembered was the sudden biting cold and the feeling as if invisible fingers had brushed his temples from the inside. He was sent to the hospital with a diagnosis of acute nervous disorder. After this incident, the atmosphere on board thickened even more. They went down to work only in pairs, and the time spent in the lower decks was strictly limited. But the oddities didn't end there. One night, the guard on duty at the pier, looking at the dark silhouette of the north wind, saw a light flash in one of the portholes of the first-class cabin. Not electric, but rather dim, yellowish, similar to the light of an old kerosene lamp. The light moved, floated along the window, and then just as suddenly went out. The guard decided that he had imagined it and did not report it. The next night, another attendant heard sounds coming from there. Muffled footsteps, creaking floorboards, quiet children's laughter, which stopped as suddenly as it began. He was about to use his walkie-talkie to report the violation when the 1962 radio broadcast began streaming from the loudspeaker above his head, which had been turned off for a week. The announcer's voice now sounded distorted, stretching the words into an eerie howl, in which alien, inhuman notes could be guessed. Igor Petrov, having learned about these incidents, did not dismiss them, but on the contrary, continued his measurements with a new obsession. He installed equipment on board that records infrasound and the slightest temperature changes. The data he received was staggering. At certain times, especially in the pre-dawn hours, the temperature in some rooms dropped to below zero, although the heating system had long been turned off. Infrasound sensors recorded low-frequency vibrations that were not perceived by the human ear, but could cause a feeling of unreasonable fear and panic. These vibrations did not come from the ship's mechanisms, but as if from the air itself, from the structure of the metal. Petrov began to build a theory. He suggested that the north wind was not just stuck in time, but had become a kind of gateway, a gap in the fabric of reality. That fog of 1962 was not a meteorological phenomenon, but some kind of anomaly, a portal. The ship passed through it and ended up in another place. And now he has brought a piece of that place with him. The footprints in the engine room, the icy metal, the distorted radio. All this was not a consequence, but a manifestation of the very essence of that other world, its physics, alien and hostile to human understanding. He did not yet know exactly where the ship had landed, but he was beginning to guess that the disappeared people might not have died in the usual sense of the word. They could be there, very close, behind the thinnest veil separating one dimension from another, and their soft laughter and footsteps were not ghostly memories, but the most real sounds from their eternal imprisonment. Petrov's idea of a gap in the fabric of reality slowly began to move from the theoretical plane to the practical, gaining ominous confirmation. He convinced the commission to conduct a risky experiment, to leave the self-powered movie cameras tuned to infrared and ultraviolet modes on board the North Wind overnight. Cameras were installed at key points: in the engine room, in the main cabin, in the captain's cabin, and on the bridge. The operation was carried out in the afternoon, and leaving the ferry at dusk, each member of the team felt an indistinct relief, as if they were escaping from an invisible pressure zone. The night was spent in tense anticipation for those on duty at the pier. The north wind was dark and silent, but the silence was deceptive, full of hidden life. In the early morning, when the fog had thickened to a milky wall, a long metallic screech came from the ferry, as if some huge bolts were shifting in invisible dimensions. The next morning, a group consisting of Petrov, Kovalev, and two of the most persistent sailors boarded the ship to retrieve the recordings. The air inside was icy, much colder than outside, and there was that sweet, unnatural smell of withered life again. Watching the recordings turned into a session of collective shock. Infrared cameras installed in the cabin recorded what the human eye could not see. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, the temperature in the room began to drop abnormally. On the screen, it appeared as waves of intense blue color spreading from the walls and floor. Human silhouettes appeared and disappeared in these waves, like drops of oil in water. They were blurry, devoid of clear features, but their movements were not chaotic. Some were sitting on chairs, others were slowly wandering between the chairs, and others, very small, seemed to be playing on the floor. It lasted about 20 minutes, after which the silhouettes dissolved, and the temperature returned to a conditional norm. The recording from the engine room was even more disturbing. There were no human images. Instead, the camera captured strange, pulsating clusters of energy that moved along the walls, leaving those elongated ice prints on the metal. These clumps then shrank, then stretched, and sometimes those thin, bony fingers could be guessed in their shape. It was as if they were feeling their surroundings, studying them without understanding or acknowledging their physical laws. But the scariest film turned out to be on a camera installed in the captain's cabin. It showed how, at exactly 2:47 a.m., the frozen hands on the clock on the wall suddenly turned with an unnatural jerk, making a full circle, and froze again at the same mark. And at that very moment, a shadow flashed in front of the lens. Not a blurred silhouette, but a clear, dark, elongated figure leaning over the captain's desk, as if reading a ship's log. The figure was completely black, not reflecting infrared rays, and disappeared as instantly as it appeared. After this experiment, the official authorities curtailed the research in a panic. The North Wind was declared a high-risk area, and access to it was prohibited for everyone except specially approved military teams, who conducted their own classified inspections. Rumors began to spread around the port. It was said that the ship was cursed, that it brought with it not just ghosts, but something worse, a hole in the universe itself. People began to avoid the abandoned pier, especially at night. The fishermen refused to go out to the part of the bay where the ferry was found, claiming that their nets were empty and the compass was spinning wildly. But Igor Petrov couldn't stop. The theory, which at first was only a speculative construction, has now become an obsession for him. He would sneak aboard during the hours when security changed, risking not only his career, but as he was beginning to understand his sanity. He spent hours sitting in the captain's cabin, peering through the misted windows, listening to the silence that was filled with whispers. He began to keep his own diary, not a ship's log, but personal notes, where he tried to analyze the nature of the phenomenon. He wrote about thin spots, about the overlap of realities, that the ferry did not just visit another dimension, but became a point of constant contact between them. And this contact was not passive. What was on the other side was also showing interest. It was studying, felt it, and perhaps she was preparing for something more. Petrov felt it with every cell of his body. The cold that now haunted him even on the shore was not just cold. It was the breath of another world. Autumn has finally come into its own, turning the coastal port into a kingdom of chilly wind and endless rains. The official investigation into the North Wind case was quietly suspended, and then completely put on the brakes. The ghost ship stood at the far pier, surrounded by a temporary fence with warning signs, gradually becoming covered with mud and cobwebs, which seemed to have finally managed to land on it. But it was only an appearance. For Igor Petrov, the ferry became an obsession, his personal grail. He resigned from the commission on the pretext of his health, but in fact all his time was now consumed by secret visits on board. He noticed that the abnormal activity increased at certain hours, always associated with the numbers 2 verse 47, whether it was day or night. At these moments, the radio came to life, carrying fragments of those very broadcasts, but now other sounds began to slip into them. Inarticulate whispers, quiet sobs, a creak similar to the friction of something solid on metal. Petrov kept installing new sensors, trying to detect the slightest changes. He brought a tape recorder on board, and in one of these phases of activity recorded something amazing. Amid the hissing and the announcer's words, a clear, frightened whisper emerged, clearly belonging to a child. "They're here, in the walls." The phrase was repeated 3 times with increasing horror, and then ended with a sound like an icy crack. It was then that Petrov drew attention to the walls themselves. He began to study them not as an engineering design but as a kind of interface. His theory of the thin spot seemed increasingly true. He suggested that the matter of the ferry, which had been in another dimension for a long time, had undergone changes. She became a conductor, a membrane between the worlds. And this membrane was not static. She hesitated. Sometimes she got thinner. He spent most of his time in the engine room, where the footprints were found. One day, at the next peak of activity, he put his palm on the cold metal between 2 elongated dents. And I felt not just cold, but a faint, barely perceptible vibration. Coming from the inside, it was not a mechanical tremor, but rather a pulsation, rhythmic and lively. He put his ear to the steel and froze. At first, there was only an echoing silence. But then, through the thickness of the metal, he heard a sound. Not a rasp or a whisper, but something else, slow, viscous, similar to the movement of liquid through pipes, but with a distinct feeling of something conscious, purposeful. It lasted for a few seconds, and then subsided. Petrov recoiled, his heart pounding in his chest. He realized that he was wrong. What was on the other side wasn't just showing interest. It lived there, and it was aware of his presence. These footprints on the walls were not random prints. They were traces of constant movement, patrolling the border. The ferry was not just a gateway. He was a cage, or even scarier, a feeding trough. And he, Igor Petrov, with his sensors and tape recorders, was the one who constantly knocked on the glass of this cage, attracting the attention of its inhabitants. The realization of this fact did not make Petrov run. On the contrary, it chained him to the sinister ferry with the force of a fatal attraction. His visits became even more frequent and prolonged. He almost moved on board, bringing with him food, a sleeping bag, and all the new equipment. The rational scientist in him was slowly giving way to a ghost hunter, a fanatic who would do anything to touch the mystery. He noticed that his own perception was beginning to change. At times it seemed to him that he saw movement out of the corner of his eye, a quick shadow at the end of the corridor, a flicker of a pale face in the porthole. The sounds also became clearer. Now he not only heard footsteps and whispers, but could also distinguish individual words, fragments of phrases, pronounced in different languages, but always full of the same thing: bewilderment and horror. Where are we going? Why can't we see the shore? Mom, I want to go home. These voices were echoes of that fateful flight, stuck in a time loop, but Petrov began to feel that some of them sounded fresher, more aware, as if their source was not just playing a recording but trying to reach him. He focused on the captain's cabin. If there was to be a clue anywhere, it was here. He read the ship's logs back and forth. The last recordings were absolutely normal. They recorded the course, speed, and weather conditions. But Petrov drew attention to the barely noticeable blots, scratches on the paper, which he had previously taken for random. At a certain angle of light, they formed strange, sinuous patterns, resembling either a map or diagrams of certain energy flows. He spent the night poring over these pages, trying to decipher them. In the early morning, at the very moment when the clock on the wall was about to make its elusive attempt to get off the ground, he felt a sharp, piercing cold. The air in the cabin thickened and became viscous. He looked up and saw that the fogged glass of the porthole was slowly clearing, as if someone was running his hand over it from the other side. Contours appeared on the worn area, indistinct and wavering. It wasn't a portrait or a landscape. It was a complex, multi-layered diagram consisting of concentric circles, spirals, and sharp, broken lines. It glowed with a dim phosphorescent light. Petrov realized that he was looking at a diagram of the phenomenon itself, a map of the thin place, and he also realized that this message was addressed to him personally. The entity that had bent over the magazine in the recording from the camera was now making contact with him. She wasn't hostile. She was curious, and she was offering him to look further than he could have imagined. With a trembling hand, he grabbed a notebook and began frantically sketching what he saw until the image faded and the glass was covered with a wet coating again. He had the feeling that he had just signed a contract from which there was no turning back. The diagram captured in his notebook became the only reality for Petrov. He forgot about sleep, about food, about the outside world. The abandoned pier, blown by an icy wind, and the dark silhouette of the north wind became his entire universe. He understood that the diagram he saw was not just a static map. It was an instruction. It showed the points of least resistance, the nodes of the energy grid, where the barrier between the worlds was the thinnest. And the main such node was not the captain's cabin or the engine room, but a small, unremarkable closet for storing mops and buckets in the depths of the lower deck, a place he passed dozens of times without noticing it. According to the diagram, it was here that all the lines and all the spirals converged. This was the epicenter of the anomaly, the site of the initial rupture. Petrov prepared for the crucial experiment with fanatical care. He brought and installed everything in the closet that could record what was happening. Cameras, voice recorders, EMF sensors, thermometers. He knew that the next peak of activity, synchronized with 247, would come in a few hours. The twilight of the early evening was slowly swallowing up port as he checked the equipment one last time and was left alone in a cramped, icy drafty room. The silence outside was absolute, as if the whole world was waiting. At exactly 2:47 a.m., everything changed. At first, the light from his flashlight went out, even though the batteries were new. Then, one by one, the indicators on the instruments went out. The silence was broken by a growing hum, coming not from outside, but from the air itself, from the metal atoms surrounding it. The walls of the closet began to glow with the same phosphorescent light as the diagram in the porthole. But this time the light was alive, pulsating, it was breathing. The air became thick as syrup, and Petrov could hardly move. In front of him, the wall began to change its structure. The steel lost its hardness, turning into a kind of dense fog in which shadows swirled. He saw them now not as blurred silhouettes, but almost clearly, the faces of people in despair, outstretched hands, mouths open in silent screaming. These were the passengers and the crew of the North Wind. They weren't ghosts. They were prisoners, stuck in limbo between worlds, eternally reliving the moment of their disappearance. and through their translucent figures, Petrov saw something else. It had no form in the human understanding. It was a fluid, unsteady substance made up of shadows and cold, with countless tentacles prominences that slowly moved, feeling the reality on this side. It was a mind, ancient, cold, and completely alien. It was it that left traces in the engine room. It was it that studied the ship. And that was what was looking at Petrov now. Not with my eyes, but with my whole being. At that moment, a flood of images, feelings, and knowledge flooded into the researcher's mind. He understood everything. The north wind didn't just get lost. He was absorbed. This being, this entity from another dimension, fed not on flesh, but on time, memory, and the very fact of existence. It trapped souls in order to relive the moment of their supreme terror endlessly, like a gourmet savoring an exquisite dish. The ship did not return because it was released. He returned as bait, as a net set up for new victims to expand his hunting territory. Petrov was not a researcher. He was the first one to bite. The realization was so monstrous that his mind couldn't stand it. He didn't scream. He just collapsed to his knees, feeling the icy emptiness seep into his body, driving out the warmth, life, and time itself. He felt his memories begin to peel off like film and float away into this pulsating mass. The last thing he saw before consciousness went out was the figure of Captain Volkov standing in the opening of the glowing wall. His face was distorted with eternal agony, and his hand was stretched out to Petrov with a gesture frozen in mute warning. The next morning, the guards found the closet empty. The equipment was dead. All records were erased. All that remained of Petrov was an open notebook with sketches of a strange scheme and his coat, cold to the touch, as if it had been lying in the cold all winter. The authorities were furious, but there was nothing to do. Access to the ferry was completely prohibited, and a high fence with barbed wire was erected around it. The north wind remained moored, silent and restless. But sometimes on foggy nights, especially in autumn, those on duty see new shadows on its deck. There are more of them, and among them, according to the most impressionable, you can see a tall, thin figure of a man wandering aimlessly along the bridge with a notebook in his hand, forever sketching things that no longer matter. The ferry, which returned without a crew, continued its voyage. Now he was sailing on the sea of time, and everyone who dared to touch his secret became his passengers. He was waiting for the next shift on duty, the next curious person, the next victim for the eternal feast of an entity from another dimension. The hunt had just begun.